You guys have been to lab, not all of you, but most of you have been to lab, yes? Okay. You missed it?
I did.
You missed it?
My band kind of.
You need to go to a different one. Okay, good. Don't miss this week. Like you would like tank yourself. It'd be like sinking slowly by missing this one. So this lab this week, let me empathize with you. It's pretty overwhelming, right? This appendicular muscles lab. So today what we're going to do is we're going to try again to give you some tools so that you don't have to rote memorize everything, so that you can really understand what's going on there. Rote memorization, FYI, is really, really hard to do with anatomy because there's so much terminology. And if you rote memorize the muscles, what can happen is that you will often do well on quizzes and poorly on practicals, right? Because you just don't have enough retention to hold on to it for 3 or 4 weeks until you get to the practical. Does that make sense to you guys? So my objective with the first part of the lecture today is to reinforce tools that will help you understand what the muscles are, what they're called, where they are, what they do, instead of just memorizing. Okay, so if I were you, I would probably, if you have your lab manual, get it out, because I'm going to ask you to try to find names of muscles. You're not being quizzed. We're just trying to put your two resources together and make sure that you can use them both. If you don't have it, it's fine. Okay. Get it open to the muscles that you've done. And what we're going to do today is we're going to start where we left off. Last time we were talking about muscle actions, right? And hopefully when you were in lab, instead of the lab aides just pointing to muscles on a cadaver, hopefully what they were doing is also showing you where the muscle was attached and what it was doing, right? So that you start to get it all at the same time. Here's what people usually do. They try to, the first round, they try to memorize all of the names of the muscles. Then they try to go back and add the actions and attachments. There's a better way to do it. A better way to do it is to try to get it for a muscle, all of the relationships at one point, right? You try to learn the muscle deeply and then you move on to the next muscle. So that's what I'm going to try to help you guys with today. Okay, so first thing is to acknowledge that when they were naming muscles, they didn't come up with a single naming convention. Muscles are named several different ways. So what we're going to do today is we're going to get to the point that we can look at the name of a muscle and pull the information out of it. Like, what is that muscle telling you, right? That make sense? Okay, so first thing is many muscles, but not all, are named by the muscle action, which is why I taught you action first, okay? So when we start with muscle actions, sometimes a muscle is named a flexor or named an extensor, yes? Okay, now, when a muscle is named a flexor, that means the vast majority of the time you would expect that muscle to be found on what surface of the joint? Anterior surface of the joint. Okay, great. Now I want you guys to tell me a flexor from your lab list.
Flexor carpi radialis.
Flexor carpi radialis. Okay, now that muscle is telling you, of course, that it's a flexor, so it's going to be on the anterior surface, but it's telling you two more things. Let's pull the information out of it, right? Flexor carpi, which means it crosses what joint? Crosses the wrist joint. And radialis tells you which side of the forearm to look for it. The lateral side of the forearm, right? So here's what the smart anatomy student does. When they see the name of a muscle, they have an assumption or a guess as to where to find the muscle, right? So you look at the name of a muscle and you say, the muscle is called this, I expect to find it there, and then you go either confirm, right? Or you fix your assumption, right? Note to self, missing something, making an improper assumption is a phenomenal learning tool. It's like, oh, I didn't think of that, because then you'll actually fix your assumption and you'll go back in there and write it down. Okay, somebody tell me an extensor. You guys have been to lab. A muscle that's called an extensor, sorry. Extensor, hallucis longus, or extensor pollicis, yeah? So if it's the extensor hallucis, it's an extensor. Let's do pollicis actually, because this is flexion and extension of the foot, so it makes it really hard, okay? So what extensor do you have up here?
That'd be the thumb.
No, what's the muscle called? pollicis what? Longus. Okay. All right, so let's figure out what we can find by that. The extensor pollicis longus should be on what side of what joint? Posterior side of the thumb. Yeah? And pollicis is, of course, thumb. And longus, did somebody teach you what longus versus brevis is referring to?
Short versus long.
Short versus long what? Tendon. Okay? It is not short versus long muscle, because sometimes the body of the muscle looks really, really short when it's a longus, but the tendon is really long. So why, for instance, is the biceps brachii long head long? It's because the tendon is long. Yes? When there is a longus brevis, a long head, a short head, it is always the length of the tendon that they're referring to. So now what I want you guys to do is when you go into lab or open lab, you go and confirm that. You go and say, long head versus short head. I think that the long head should be that one with the long tendon. Then check to see if you're right, and you probably will be. Does that make sense? Okay, so abductors and extensors, we did that. Abductors and adductors. Somebody tell me a muscle that is called an abductor. Abductor. Abductor pollicis. Now let's get to the damn thumb again. Got 3 different tendons that are going to cross the thumb. Okay? I've got a flexor, an extensor, and an abductor. Tell me what order they should go in. The tendons. What should be the most anterior one? Come on. What should be the most anterior one on the thumb? The flexor. What should be the next one you run into? Abductor. What should be on the back? Extensor. Got it? Okay. Now, note to self. Do not ever, ever, ever allow yourself to learn a muscle at a single point, right? You don't point to one part of a tendon or one part of a muscle. You always follow it, right? Because what if they were just flip-flopped right there, that the muscle was actually on this side, you know? So what you want to do is you want to find what you think it is and then follow it and make sure you confirm that it is actually the muscle that you think it is. That make sense? Okay. So tell me an adductor muscle. Adductor. Yeah, all of the adductors right here, these are adductors. And now tell me what to expect of an abductor or an adductor. Where do you expect to find adductors again? Medial surface of the joint. Where do you expect to find abductors? Lateral surface, right? Okay, great. Levators and depressors. I know you know one levator. Levator scapulae. Where do you expect to find it on the scapula? Think about it. Not memorization. Where do you want to find something that will elevate the scapula? Superior side. Yes, good. The levator scapulae is on the top side of the scapula. Okay? Now, you didn't learn a depressor, but I'll teach you the name of a depressor just so that you can see. Okay? Depressor. There's a muscle called the depressor anguli oris. Depressor anguli oris. Where do you expect to find it? Mouth, at the angles, this muscle. Depressor anguli oris. Yeah? That makes sense? Okay. Now, pronator and supinator. A muscle called a pronator. You know, learned one, didn't you? Pronator teres. Yes, the pronator teres. You know what joint it has to cross in order to pronate. What joint does it have to cross? Show me pronation. Pronation. What joint does it have to cross? It has to cross the elbow joint. Pronator teres, yes? Okay, that is the action. Supinator. Show me supination. Supination. Has to cross what joint? Has to cross the elbow joint, right? The supinator is a muscle that's crossing the elbow joint. It's hard to see, it's actually kind of deep. You have to like flip back the brachioradialis and a couple of other muscles. We've got it dissected out on at least one cadaver on each campus, right? So, are you hearing what I'm doing is telling you that the name tells you something, and you need to be able to pull the nugget of information out of the name, and then confirm whether or not you were right, okay? Is this a harder way to learn? Yes. Is it a better way to learn? Yes. It is going to take a little while, but luckily, you do not have your lab practical for at least 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, which is why we put appendicular muscles before axial, because they're harder, yeah? So now, next week when you go to the easier set of muscles, which are axial, you do axial, you feel good about those, and then you reinforce appendicular. And note to self, There are open labs. In addition, I will put this up today. There's going to be an extra open lab on Saturdays because Saturday open labs have been really well attended. I didn't even know people would do things on Saturdays. Like I would never have in college. So there's going to be an extra one on the Jordan campus on Saturday. It's going to be in the morning, so 10 to 12, and then there's 1 to 3 on. So you could actually go to both if you wanted to. They're really wanting to get that reinforcement, and they're taught by 2 different instructors. So, and in addition, there are also going to be more open labs during the weeks coming up to the practical, right? Okay, that makes sense? Okay, all right, so let's talk about rotator cuff muscles. Now, the rotator cuff muscles have a bunch of actions, but among them, they allow you to rotate a bone around its axis. Does anybody know where the rotator cuff muscles are? They're part of the shoulder, right? And so what they are going to do is stabilize and allow for rotation around that. And then sphincters. You're not learning sphincters now, but you're definitely going to this semester. A sphincter is a muscle that encircles a tube, okay? And when they contract, they will close the tube, and when they relax, they will open the tube. And you have sphincters closing right now, or else you would be peeing down your leg, right? Skeletal muscle sphincters, which allow you to control when you urinate. It takes the first few years of your life to get control of them. Up to 5 years if you're a boy. The boys actually have a little harder time controlling that sphincter. And then you have digestive system sphincter at the bottom too. Those are skeletal muscles, so you can control them. So you can control when you poop. And then you have smooth muscle sphincters all through your digestive system. You're not in control of those. Does that make sense? So you'll learn sphincters this semester as well. Tensor. Do you know of a muscle called a tensor? Yeah, this one is like so hard to spell because it's got like 72 vowels in it. Tensor fascia. Where the hell all those vowels come from? Like every single vowel except you, I think, is in those. So that's the tensor fascia lata. Okay, so you do not need to write these right now, but a good exercise would be to go back and find them all, don't you think? Not necessarily in class, but certainly later. Okay, so now let's talk about this. Muscles are also named by the orientation of the fibers, the directionality of the fibers. You can't see individual fibers, but you can see bundles of fibers. And so if you look at a muscle and the fibers look like they're running straight up and down, parallel to the long axis of the body, that muscle will be a rectus or an erector. As in erection. You're never going to forget that, will you? Straight up and down, right? So tell me 2 rectus muscles. The rectus abdominis, yeah, us is, and the rectus femoris. So here's your rectus abdominis muscle, right? The direction of the fibers runs relatively parallel to the long axis of the body. Note to self, when you've got an us is, it's usually us for the first word and is for the second. Rectus abdominis, rectus femoris, yes, okay, and spelling does count, especially in lab. Okay, so those are your rectus muscles, and then you also have transversus or transverse muscles. You haven't learned it yet, but maybe some of you guys know. Do you know a muscle that's a transversus? Transversus abdominis, yes. With a transverse muscle, the fibers run almost perpendicular to the long axis of the body. Okay, you're going to learn that one next week. Transverse abdominis, okay. And then you have oblique muscles. Oblique muscles, just like an oblique section, are neither parallel nor perpendicular, but some other angle, right? And you have your external abdominal obliques that run this direction, and you have your internal abdominal obliques that run that direction. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what oblique means. And although I didn't write it in here, there's another one. What if a muscle is called an orbicularis? Yeah, it's running a circle. This muscle right here, you'll learn next week. This is the orbicularis oris, right? Running in an orb or a circle around the mouth. And then how about you guys tell me, some of you guys already know, maybe others do too. Anybody know what this one's called? Yeah, that's the orbicularis oculi. Does that make sense? So sometimes you name it for the direction of fibers. Okay, and then what are other reasons that you name muscles what you name? The reason that I had you learn all of that terminology is because it'll make this part easier for you. Because Now, it sounds completely ridiculous for a person to look for a muscle called the brachialis in the thigh. Because you're like, no, that ain't gonna be there, right? But many of you did not know that brachial or brachium meant arm before a couple of weeks ago, right? Because it just wasn't in your knowledge base, but now it is. So if it is a muscle called the brachialis, you know where to look for it. If it is a muscle called the rectus femoris, you know that it's straight up and down, running over what bone? The femur, exactly, good. If they are intercostal muscles, where do you look for them? Between the ribs, which is exactly where they are, good. If it is a temporalis muscle, it overlies what bone? The temporal bone, exactly, got it? Okay. Now, sometimes they're named for their relative location to one another. You have three vastus muscles. Vastus means big, okay? And they're pretty damn easy when you realize you've got a vastus lateralis, an intermedius, and a medialis, right? And they're all named relative to one another. Three big muscles in that order, right? Okay? Those are all part of what group of muscles, by the way? The vastus muscles. 4 of them. 4 muscles. Quadriceps femoris group, yes. Does anybody know what the other muscle is besides those 3 that's in the quadriceps femoris group? Yeah, rectus femoris. Good. Okay. And then, so let's see what these are. Okay. So you've got the flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus. Let's look at the last word. Okay. It's trying to tell you something about the relationship of those 2 muscles to each other. You've got a superficialis and a profundus. Profundus as in profound, as in deep. Right? Got it? So where are those 2 muscles going to be relative to one another? Superficialis is going to be on top of the profundus. And then look at the other names and see what you can pick out from it. You look at the flexor digitorum superficialis and you go, okay, it's a flexor digitorum. Where do you expect to find it? Anterior surface where? Going into the digits, yeah. It's not a flexor carpi, it's a flexor digitorum, yes. Okay. So it's a flexor anterior surface going into the fingers. And then I've got a superficialis and a profundus. Does that make sense? So there's 2 of them. Got it? Now, FYI, you can't always see them going all the way into the fingers, but if you ask one of the lab instructors to pull on one of the tendons, you can see the fingers do this. So you can see that it's actually moving the fingers and not just the wrist. Does that make sense to you guys? Don't pull on the tendons yourself. You're welcome to touch things, but no yanky, okay? Let the lab instructors do it, because they know which ones are delicate and which ones will actually move and which ones are preserved. Okay, and then supraspinatus versus infraspinatus. That's trying to tell you something about the relationship of those 2 muscles. Supraspinatus is where? Above the what? Spine of the scapula. And the infraspinatus is? Below the spine of the scapula. Okay, now, let me reinforce to you the reason that we made you learn all of those damn bone markings. Because the supraspinatus originates on the what? Supraspinous fossa of the scapula. Yeah? And the infraspinatus originates on the infraspinous fossa of the scapula. Did you notice on your muscle list, although it feels like it, we don't have you learn all of the attachments. You have to learn an action for every muscle, but not attachments. Why did we do that? Because we didn't have you learn attachments that you didn't learn on the bones. Yes? Because otherwise it would be rote memorization, right? Because if I had you learn a little point on a bone that you never learned when you learned the bone, then it's rote memorization, right? So it has to either be relatively obvious, like some external feature that you can find, right? Or it has to be something that you learned before. Is that okay? So altogether, what we were trying to do is make the story stick together. It takes a while before it hangs together as a story, but it eventually will if you let it. Okay, so specific body regions. Now let's see how else muscles are named. Muscles are also named for their shape or structure. This is relatively obvious, but let's make sure that we reinforce it. The muscle that is called deltoid is called that because of what? Because it's shaped like a triangle, like a delta, right? Now, who remembers enough geometry to tell me what a trapezoid is shaped like? Yeah, it's kind of like a diamond, like a rhombus, but not necessarily with like right angles, right? So it's a diamond shape. For some reason, I always had trouble remembering which one were traps and which ones were lats. This is the dorsal and traps. But then the trapezius actually has this shape. It goes from the occipital bone all the way out to the tips of the shoulders. Then as a triangle, it goes down to the bottom of the back, right? Those are the trapezius muscles because it's shaped like a trapezoid. Good? Okay, quadratus lumborum, you haven't learned that yet, but tell me what the name is implying as about the shape and the location. Quadratus lumborum. 4 sides, where are you going to find it? The lumbar region. There's 2 little rectangular muscles right back here. Quadratus lumborum, okay? And let's talk about that. Quadratus lumborum. Let me get you guys some thinking. The quadratus lumborum, when you learn it, which of these 2 actions could possibly be one of the actions of quadratus lumborum? Flexion of the spine or extension of the spine? Extension, yes. Back side, that makes sense? Okay. All right. So, serratus anterior. Okay. Serratus is telling you something. What's it telling you? It's got a serrated edge. Have you ever seen somebody who's in like amazing shape and you can see the right down here? Yeah? That's the serratus anterior. It goes all the way from the backside up to here. And it kind of comes into contact with your abdominal muscle. It's not part of your abdominal muscle. Serratus anterior. Okay, platysma. Anybody know what plat means? As in ductal platypus? Flat, exactly. You got a big flat muscle right here called the platysma. It allows you to do lots of platysma. Okay, so muscles are also named for their size or for the length of their tendons. If you run into a longus and a brevis with reference to one another, then they are telling you that one of them has a longer tendon than the other. So you guys tell me a longus and a brevis. Fibularis longus, yes, and fibularis brevis. And those, again, are telling you something about the length of the tendon, not the length of the muscle. Is that okay? Okay. A vastus is great or big. So you've already done them, but name 3 vastuses for me. Vastus lateralis, intermedius, and medialis. Okay, so now I want you to put some thought together. This quadriceps group that we've got right here. The quadriceps group, guys, is on the anterior surface of the thigh, yes? And let's say it crosses the anterior surface of the hip and the anterior surface of the knee, okay? You guys tell me, what action will it probably do at the hip and what action will it probably do at the knee? Crosses both. What will it do at the hip? Flexion at the hip. What will it do at the knee? Extension. Got it? Okay. Yeah? So, okay. So we got our vastus. We got a major and a minor. They're with comparison to one another. If you have a major and a minor, one of them's big and one of them's small, and usually they have the same first word. Tell me a major minor pair. The teres major and teres minor. The pectoralis major and pectoralis minor. So they are usually slightly bigger and smaller than one another. Good. Okay. The maximus, minimus, and there's medius in the middle there too. Okay. Those are telling you sizes as well, and I know you can think of maximus muscles. Gluteus maximus, medius, and minimus, right? Those are relative to one another. Okay. And of course, this is the gluteal region. So if you can get back there, and you're like, I'm in the butt. I got a big one, a medium one, a little one. Do you actually have to memorize the name of the damn muscles? You do not have to memorize the name of the muscles. You're like, big butt muscle, gluteus maximus. That's what it is. Okay, so, and then this is how I wish all muscles were named, but they definitely are not. If all muscles had a naming convention, I would vote for this one. And it is muscles named for their attachments. Because if you name them for their attachments and you use the convention which is used, which is origins before insertions, then don't you kind of know actions already? So if we call this one the clavicosclavicular humeri muscle, we'd be like, oh, okay, that's that, right? So the sternocleidomastoid muscle, right? Origins, insertions. Does anybody know one of the actions of the sternocleidomastoid? If you pull the insertion closer to the origin, yeah, you can do this. If you use both of them at the same time, you can feel them tensing when you do that. If you use one of them, you can pull it to the opposite side. So feel this one as you turn your head that way. Right by your mastoid process. Feel that one as you turn it that way. That makes sense? Okay? So that's the sternocleidomastoid. Okay? The brachioradialis. It's telling you where it is. It's telling you the joint that it crosses. And then you can figure out the action, can't you? If the brachioradialis crosses, and you just have to know which side of the joint it crosses on, right? It's going from the brachio to the radialis, right? And let's say it's on the anterior surface. It is. Kind of, it's on the lateral surface. Would it be more likely to do flexion at the elbow or extension at the elbow? Flexion at the elbow, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So that's brachioradialis. The sternohyoid goes from the sternum to the hyoid bone. Origin first, then insertion. Pulls the hyoid bone down. Got it? Okay? All right. So muscles are also named for their number of origins. If they are a biceps, they have 2 origins sharing a common insertion. Okay? Now, why would you have 2 origins sharing a common insertion? Remember that if you have a different origin, you can increase or decrease the range of motion. Does that make sense? So if it goes further up, it's more likely to have more actions up here, right? Comes further down, you're probably not going to have more actions, but will you have more tensile strength? Right? So let's think about that. You got the biceps brachii, which is 2 different origins up here and 1 insertion, right? And then let's compare the biceps brachii to the brachialis for a second, okay? So let's think about a logic question for you. The biceps brachii has 2 origins that are up here, and they cross both the shoulder joint and the elbow joint. But the brachialis is actually stronger, and it's deep to the biceps brachii. It has an origin on the humerus and an insertion down here on the forearm, okay? So can anybody tell me, and I know you know, but I want you to verbalize it. Why can the biceps brachii flex both the shoulder and the elbow, but the brachialis can only flex the elbow? Yeah, it's because of where they cross, right? So the biceps brachii crosses both joints and can have action at both joints, and the brachialis only crosses one. This one's stronger though. Like short little body, right? The little squatty sprinter person right there. So that one's stronger, but this one actually has more range of motion. Does that make sense? Okay, find me another biceps group. You got another biceps that you learned this week. Yeah, it is. Biceps femoris, okay? Think about the biceps femoris. The biceps femoris is part of what group back here? What's this group called? It's called a hamstrings group, okay? Now, I'm going to test the femoris group, and then I'm going to have you guys answer some questions. The biceps femoris group, let's say it crosses the hip and crosses the knee on the posterior side. Okay, not all pieces of it do, by the way, okay? So, tell me, with the biceps femoris group, if it crosses the hip and crosses the knee, it could do what at the hip? Extension, and what at the knee? Flexion. Yeah? Okay. Do you see that that is better than memorizing the actions? Figuring out the actions is better. Yes? Will you be able to figure out all of them? Probably not, but most of the lab instructors don't make you write all of them. Most of them make you write 1 or 2 of the actions of the muscle. Does that make sense? Okay, so 4 origins is a quadricep group. 4 origins sharing a common insertion. And the quadriceps group, we already talked about it. Where is it? Where's the quadriceps group? Quadriceps femoris crosses the anterior hip, at least some of them do, and crosses all the way past the knee. Quadriceps femoris. So 4 origins, common insertion over the femur. Got it? Okay. So let's quiz. Let's see what, from the name of the muscle, you can figure out about both the location and the possible action of the muscle. You with me? Tibialis anterior. Where are you going to find it? Anterior surface of the tibia. Okay, I'll give you 2 choices. That muscle would more likely be responsible for dorsiflexion or plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion. Yes. Got it? Okay, dorsiflexion. Because on the anterior surface, the tibialis anterior, right? Got it? Okay, let's do the next one. Temporalis. Where are you going to find it? Here. Okay, now let me tell you a little bit about it, and then I want you to tell me the logical action of it, okay? Starts up here, goes down to here. Starts up on the temporal bone, goes down to the mandible. It is more likely to be responsible for elevation or depression of the mandible.
Elevation.
Elevation. Got it. Good? Okay. Elevation of the mandible. The sternohyoid, we already talked about it. You guys don't even learn that muscle. But the sternohyoid goes from the sternum to the hyoid bone, and it actually pulls the hyoid bone down. Okay? The supraspinatus. Now, in addition to, I want you guys to think about this for a second. Knowing where it is, the supraspinatus. You know where its origin is? Does anybody remember its insertion? Even generally? Go look it up. Okay. So it originates where? Supraspinous fossa of the scapula. And find out where it inserts. Greater tubercle of the humerus. Now, without looking, I want you guys to tell me the supraspinous fossa of the scapula to greater tubercle of the humerus. Anybody want to try to guess an action for it? What do you think it might be able to do? It's got several, but elevate what? Oh, it can help with that. That's not its primary, but it's crossing the shoulder, so it's going to have a shoulder action. Yes. Okay. So how about abduction or abduction? Choose one. Abduction. You can't do abduction because it's on the wrong side, right? Okay. Good. How about if it was going to do flexion of the shoulder or extension of the shoulder, which one would we be able to help with? Extension is on the back side, right? Does that make sense? Okay? So you can look at where it is and you can start piecing together what it could do, and then you go see whether you're right? And then you move the damn thing on your own body if you can to figure out what it does. Okay? So that's the supraspinatus. Erector spinae muscles. Where's that telling you? Straight up and down, right next to the spine, choose an action. Extension, not flexion, right? Extension of the vertebral column or extension of the torso. Got it? Okay. Flexor carpi radialis. What are you going to find it? Tell me everything you can about it. It's on the what? Anterior surface, crossing the what joint? Crossing the wrist. And it's on the what side? Lateral side. Yes? Good? Okay. Extensor pollicis longus. We've done it, but look at the name. Tell me everything you can tell me about it. Posterior side, running down the thumb, and longus. There's two of them. It's the one with the longer tendon. Yeah, extensor pollicis longus. Got it? Okay. Depressor anguli oris. We did that. You're not going to learn that one, but I want you to tell me how you can figure out. Depressor anguli oris. Right? It's like almost telling you exactly where to look for it. And you just go find it and say, yep, that's exactly where I thought it would be, right? Vastus intermedius. What is it telling you? Big one in the middle. Yes? Big one in the middle. Good. And levator scapulae. Where do you expect to find it? Above the scapula, and it's going to be pulling it up, right? Good? Okay. So, here is one of the things that I do. Some of you guys are super visual people and you need all the visuals. Some of you are verbal people and some of you are some mix of them. I will tell you what I did when I went through my lab manual and the last time I taught lab, because I'm a word person, not a picture person. What I would do is I would go find the muscle and I would write myself little notes about where to look for it. If it was lateral, I would write L, right? If it was deep, I would write D. If it was anterior, I'd write A, right? So it's like a little roadmap for me to go to, right? And then I can go find it. So if I'm looking for the vastus lateralis, that's a super easy one. It's an anterior muscle on the lateral side, and it is superficial, right? Because it's not deep to anything else, right? Actually, it's a little deep to the tensor fascial artery. Right? That makes sense? So I just like make myself a note so it's not like trying to reinvent the wheel every damn time. Like know exactly where to look for it. Draw yourself a picture if you're good at art. Okay, so everybody good? It's going to take you a little while. This is a lot of times where people give up. If you let yourself get behind with this set of muscles, you may very well never recover in the semester. So invest now for dividends later, okay? But you can get through this. People do it every damn semester, and it's not easy for any of them, but it's totally possible for all of you. Okay, so any questions? Got questions? Okay, as far as quizzing, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to let you guys have until Thursday to like get a deep absorption of the appendicular muscles, right? Because everybody will have had them by Thursday. And then the quiz you guys are going to have on Thursday will have appendicular muscles, a little bit hard questions so that you can start seeing what's coming, right? Axial muscles, easy questions, because some of you guys will have had it and some of you won't, right? But you should be prepared anyway for what's happening in the lab. And then the rest of the stuff that we're going to do in this chapter will also be on that quiz. So that'll be not Tuesday but Thursday to give you some time. And FYI, I think I mentioned this to you, but I'll mention it again. When it comes to your muscle test, which isn't for a while, right? You've got a while to absorb all of this stuff. When it comes to your muscle test, all the muscles on the lab list will be part of your muscle test. But I do less memorization than I do logic. So for instance, I could ask questions instead of what is this muscle, and I do ask some of those. I could say, there's a muscle that is attached on the anterior surface of the arm from the humerus to the radius. Which of these actions is logical, right? And then I do flexion at the elbow, flexion at the shoulder, extension at the elbow, extension at the shoulder, abduction at the shoulder, right? And like you will have enough knowledge where you're like, that's crap, that can't happen, right? Or I could do it the other way. I could say, okay, a muscle has this action, tell me which one's the origin and which one's the insertion. That makes sense? So it's like muscle mechanics and muscle logic that helps to reinforce the muscles that you are memorizing. And what I will use is muscles that you have memorized, right? But instead of saying name the muscle, I'll say attachment points, tell me the action, or action, tell me the attachment points. Got it? Okay. And it'll take you a little while to get it, but it's okay, because you don't have a test for a while, you just got a quiz next Thursday. Okay. You guys are super quiet today. Give me some feedback. Questions, issues? You gonna go drop class today? No, don't do it. You don't get any money back at this point, do you? I don't think so. I think last week was the last week you could get any money back. Okay. Okay, so we are going to now switch gears. And now I'm going to let you guys sit with that stuff and study it in lab and then reinforce it with a quiz. But now I'm going to switch gears and we're going to start talking about muscle as relevant to physiology, right? So instead of just learning the names and structures of like individual muscles, we're going to drill down to the microscopic and submicroscopic tissue of muscles to figure out how contraction occurs. Okay? Now, this stuff will not be reinforced in lab, but you will absolutely need it for physiology. And when you get into the muscle stuff in physiology, we don't go back over this anatomy. So you're going to have to like try to make sure that you absorb it. Okay? All right, so let's start with the basics of where we're going with muscle tissue. Okay, so what is muscle tissue like? How is it similar to other tissues and how is it different? First off, a couple of differences than most tissues. Muscle is excitable, meaning that you can stimulate it with electricity and it will respond, okay? The only other tissue besides your muscle tissues that do that is nervous tissue. And if you zap it, it's going to respond, right? Nervous tissue and muscle tissue. And the way that muscle responds is the second one. It's called contractility. Contractility means that when I zap it, either internally or if I get electrocuted, what happens to my muscles? They contract. Exactly. What is happening at the molecular level of muscle is it's actually taking chemical energy in the form of ATP and converting it to kinetic or mechanical energy in movement, right? And you guys probably had enough physics or chemistry to know that energy conversions are really inefficient. Does that sound familiar? You don't get all of the energy converted. You tend to lose a lot as what? Heat, exactly. Which is why muscle contraction actually generates a lot of heat as a byproduct. So if you go running and it's 20 degrees outside, what are you still going to do? You're still going to sweat because you generate a lot of heat. We also use that purposely to heat your body, right? When you're cold, you'll do really fast muscle contractions and relaxations to generate the heat as a byproduct. Shivering. Okay, but muscle also has two other things. It's also extensible, meaning that because we'll see today that muscle isn't just muscle tissue, it also has connective tissue in it. You can stretch muscle. So for instance, if you were gonna go for a long run, you'll be better off if you actually stretch the muscle. You can increase the range of motion, make it less likely to damage the muscle. So it's stretchable, but it's also snapbackable. So it's also got elasticity. It wouldn't do you any good to stretch a muscle if you made it flaccid when you stretched it. It will also spring back. So there's elasticity in the connective tissue with muscle. Okay, now we're not going to go through them again, but you're going to be responsible for them. You remember the muscle table that was in the histology notes that compared striated or not, uninucleated or multinucleated, voluntary or involuntary? You're responsible for that again. Okay, in this set of notes, we're not going to go through it again. Okay, so make sure that you can still compare the muscles to one another. Okay, so let's talk briefly about the functions of muscle tissue, and then we'll get into the details of muscle tissue. Okay, so muscle tissue, of course we know that muscle makes you wiggle, but that's not all muscle does at all. Muscle, of course, is responsible for motion, both moving your skeleton and your skin around, and also moving stuff through tubes in your body or organs, right? Like moving stuff through your heart and moving stuff through all your tubes. Muscle is also, however, responsible for holding you still. So in order to have postural stability, when you stand up, I have to have ab contraction and back and leg and butt contraction and neck contraction. So if I was paralyzed, I couldn't do this, right? I couldn't stand in front of you. So postural stability, and then stabilizing your joints. When we looked at those synovial joints, we said that you could stabilize a synovial joint by strapping a strong muscle around it. And the more strong muscle you have around the joint, the more stable the joint. And then some places muscle is mostly supportive. It's less about wiggling and more about support. The pubococcygeal muscles right here, right? There's a floor of skeletal muscles right here. They hold all your junk in, right? Your urinary bladder and your uterus. If you have a whole bunch of big-headed babies in a row, you can rip the hell out of those muscles and you can have uterine prolapse, in which your uterus just flops around downtown, right? Something to look forward to, yeah? I'm always like, you should let me teach maturation because I can tell them some stuff that will make them not want to touch a penis ever. Or just not ever, it would never work, right? For a while. But in Utah, you're not allowed to teach anything about intercourse. Did you know that, guys? Not anything about it. Okay, so supportive, these muscles right here, in addition to, of course, wiggling your torso, if they are really toned, they also squish your organs against the body wall, right, and support them, right? If you have to have emergency abdominal surgery, like you have to go in really quickly, like you're having an emergency C-section or whatever emergency surgery, they just slice right through them. And then what happens is you lose the structural support of the muscles and you're going to get a pooch, even if you don't have any subcutaneous fat. If you, however, do not have an emergency C-section, have a planned C-section like I have a heart problem, so they knew I couldn't go into labor, and they had planned a C-section, then they can carefully pull apart the muscle fibers so they don't have to slice any of them, right? Pull them all apart, go between the fibers, just slice the connective tissues, heals right back together, you get your six-pack back in about 2.5, 3 months, right? Way back when I had a six-pack. I did. And I got it back in 3 months, and then I lost it. It's still in here somewhere. Okay, guarding openings, your sphincters guard your openings. And then the other thing that your muscle does for you is keeps your fluids moving. And I know we think of the heart as keeping blood moving, and of course it does, right? But in addition to the heart, skeletal muscle also keeps your fluid moving. So skeletal muscle contractions, you've got skeletal muscle, of course, in your legs, right? And you've got veins and also lymphatic vessels running up your legs. They're going against gravity. A vein is trying to carry blood back to the heart. It's pretty low pressure, so it's hard to get there. What helps is you squish on your skeletal muscles, and the veins next to them get squished, right? And then since the veins have valves in them, it forces unidirectional flow of the blood. So basically, if you're more active, you have better fluid flow, both blood and lymph. That makes sense? Okay, all right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to drill into a skeletal muscle and look at how it's packaged and the connective tissue and all of that kind of stuff in it. So let's look at it. Okay, when you look at a skeletal muscle, and I think this is trying to be like one, I can't tell which head, one of the heads of the biceps brachii, but I just can't quite tell which one. So this is a skeletal muscle, okay? You're looking at a cross-section of it, and we'll drill down deep into it. But before we get deep into the skeletal muscle, let's look at the tissue that is wrapping around it. A skeletal muscle is not just skeletal muscle tissue. It is more than that. So it has connective tissue around the outside, and this connective tissue around the outside is called epimysium. Anytime you see the prefix MYS, or it could be a suffix too, it means muscle. So what does the word epimysium mean? Upon the muscle. It's on the outside of the muscle. Does that make sense? Okay, so the epimysium. Now, I'm not going to tell you, I want you to tell me. The epimysium's job is to hold the muscle intact. So if some big old beefy dude went outside and lifted a car, right? We do not want the muscle to bust apart, right? So what kind of tissue would you make the epimysium out of? Dense, irregular, which is what it's made out of. Does that make sense? Dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay, so dense, irregular connective tissue is what your epimysium is made of. Before we go deeper, let's attach the epimysium to the tendon and then attach the tendon to the bone. Okay, so the epimysium is made of dense, irregular, but the tendon is made of what? Dense, regular. Okay, so if I want a really strong fabric, the fabric is strongest in the fabric, not at the seams. So what I want to do is not have a seam. So what I take is the dense, irregular connective tissue that's wrapping around as the epimysium, and then I just weave those collagen fibers continuously into the dense, regular, and then there's no seam between the tendon and the actual epimysium, right? Okay, so why do you rarely pull a muscle off of its tendon? It's because there's no seam there, right? It's a continuous fabric. Okay, so now let's make a really strong association of the tendon to the bone, right? What is the superficial layer of the periosteum made of? What kind of tissue? Dense, irregular. So again, don't make a seam. Take that dense, irregular from the tendon and weave it into the dense, irregular from the periosteum. And then you can see why, although it happens, it rarely happens that you pull a muscle off a tendon or pull a tendon off a bone. Does that make sense? Okay. So all of those tissues are pretty much continuous with one another. Okay. So now let's take this and wrap it even deeper. All right. So this one wrap is not. That's driving me bonkers. Thanks. This one wrap is not enough for strength. Okay, so now we're going to take this epimysium and we're going to thin it out just a little bit. And it's not exactly dense irregular still. It's kind of like between a dense irregular and a realer. And we're going to thin it out a little bit, and instead of just wrapping it around the outside, we're going to actually wrap it around individual bundles of muscle cells inside the muscle. Okay, this bundle of muscle cells is called a fascicle. Okay, so I'm going to take this and thin it out. I'm going to wrap it around each individual bundle of muscle cells called a fascicle. When I take it and fold it in, now it's called perimysium. Perimysium, okay? Now, let's look at a fascicle. What the heck is a fascicle? A fascicle you can actually see. Okay, when you look at a muscle and you think you can see the direction of the fibers, you can't see fibers because they're microscopic, but you can see bundles of fibers called fascicles. So that's what you're seeing here. This looks like you're seeing the fibers, you're actually seeing the bundles of fibers. That makes sense? So a fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers, right? A bundle of muscle fibers. So this perimysium wraps around each fascicle, but that's still not strong enough. I want one more layer of connective tissue to make sure that this muscle will not bust apart, okay? And now I'm going to take this connective tissue that was the perimysium, and then I'm going to fold it in. Watch. I'm going to wrap it around each individual muscle cell or fiber, and now I'm going to call it endomysium. Okay? The endomysium wraps around every individual muscle cell. Here's a muscle cell. It looks weird, but I'll explain why it looks weird in a minute. So the endomysium wraps around every single one. Okay, so the order from the outside is epi, yeah? Mysium, the thickest. Fold it in and thin it out, wrap it around a fascicle. It's called what? Perimysium. Fold that in and thin it out a little bit and wrap it around each cell, and it's called what? Endomysium. That is what holds a muscle together despite the tensile strength that you require of it. right? All of those layers of connective tissue. Got it? So epi, peri, and endo are continuous with one another. And one of the things we'll see is when we get to the nervous system, it's exactly the same organization as a nerve has. A nerve is wrapped in epineurium, right? And then it folds in and wraps around bundles, and it's called perineurium. And then it folds in and wraps around each individual little axon, and it's called endoneurium. So we'll see the same pattern later. Okay, all right. So now let's talk about nerve and blood supply to muscle. All right, so here's something that's true about muscle. It's like incredibly energetically expensive to run a muscle. So what do you think about its blood supply? If it's incredibly energetically expensive, does it need a lot of blood? Yeah, it needs a lot of oxygen, a lot of nutrients. So what we can see is this muscle right here is stained so that you can see the fibers. But if you stained it instead so that you could see the capillaries, what you would see is every single one of these cells would have a snuggly capillary net all the way around it. So muscle is incredibly vascular. That is part of the reason why when you eat a cow muscle, which is a steak, it's a cross-section of a cow muscle, what color is it? It's red, of course, because it's an incredibly vascular tissue. It's got capillaries around every single one, okay? What generally happens is when you have a muscle, usually somewhere along the belly of the muscle, there's one big artery coming in, one big vein leaving, and one big nerve going to it. But then, of course, it's going to have to split into arterioles, and then it's going to have to snuggle up with everything, every single cell. So it's really, really vascular tissue. In addition to being really, really vascular, it is also highly innervated. Remind me what I mean when I say highly innervated. Lots of nerves. Okay, so this is important. It's going to be important in both A and P. So here are 3 muscle cells, 1, 2, 3. Okay, and this is one axon from a neuron. Okay, what I'm telling you now is that every single muscle cell has to have direct innervation from the nervous system in order to contract. So every single muscle cell, if there are thousands of them in a muscle, must receive a stimulus from the nervous system. So that's how highly innervated it is. So what happens, for instance, if this part gets damaged and this muscle cell loses innervation? Can you tell me about this one? It's going to be paralyzed. Yeah? This one muscle cell is going to be paralyzed unless and until it regains innervation. Has anybody in here ever had nerve damage? If you've ever had nerve damage, let's imagine we've got nerve damage here. What can happen is if I have nerve damage here, I can have paralysis, right? In which the muscle doesn't work at all and I can't do this, right? Or I could have weakness. Weakness would be when some of the fibers are paralyzed and not others, right? That makes sense? And if I damage the peripheral nerve out here, what the doctor will tell you, she'll say, hey, you might get re-innervation of that muscle. I'll give it 2 years and you can see what happens. So the peripheral nervous system has the possibility but not the guarantee of re-innervation. But what if I transect my spinal cord? Is my doctor going to tell me that you might actually walk again? No, you are not going to walk again because the peripheral nervous system has almost zero capacity for re-innervation. That makes sense? So it just depends on where you damage and like whether it's CNS or PNS. We'll talk about that when we get to the nervous system too. So highly innervated and really, really, really vascular. Okay, let's move into the microscopic and functional anatomy of skeletal muscle tissue. So now, stuff that you remember from studying the histology of skeletal muscle tissue, you should remember that, first of all, remember that we're using the word muscle fiber and muscle cell interchangeably, right? Okay, so a muscle fiber is the same thing as a muscle cell. So you remember that skeletal muscle is striated, yes? You're going to learn why it's striated today. And you also remember that skeletal muscle is multinucleated. Do you remember that? Okay, so now I'm going to show you a stylized picture of a muscle cell, and we're going to start to break it down. So here's the dadgum tragedy with muscle. What they did is they took all of the cell structures that you spent 1610 learning, they renamed every damn one of them, right? So you know what a cell membrane is, right? Like, we don't call it a cell membrane anymore in muscle. We call it a sarcolemma. You learned cytoplasm? No, now it's sarcoplasm. You learned the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. No, let's call it the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So they renamed everything in the skeletal muscle fiber. I hate them too. So why am I making you learn these terms? Because these are the terms that they use in physiology and in further classes, so you're just going to have to swallow it. You're just going to have to get used to the fact that they renamed everything. They are not different structures than you learned in 1610, but this doesn't look a darn thing like the cells you studied in 1610, does it? No, it does. It doesn't, right? It has all of the cell stuff that you learned plus extra stuff. So, of course, it's got a nucleus, at least one. Of course, it's got cytoplasm. Of course, it's got a cell membrane. It's got some mitochondria. It's got smooth and rough ER. But then it's got these things, which no cells have, except muscle cells. These are there because they're related to the unique function of muscle, which is contraction. So we'll get into those, okay? So let's talk about skeletal muscle fibers. So this is an individual skeletal muscle fiber or cell. An individual skeletal muscle fiber is microscopic in width. It's between 10 and 100 micrometers, so you can't see it with the naked eye. But it is up to a foot in length. So they're really, really long and skinny. I don't know if a foot is average, is Shaquille O'Neal is a foot, or is it just some regular person? I don't know. So maybe his are way longer, but an individual fiber can be up to a foot in length. Does anybody know the longest muscle in the body? I'll tell you where it is and you see if you can name it. It goes from the anterior superior iliac spine and wraps around the inner surface of your knee. Yeah, that's the sartorius. That's the longest muscle in the body. Okay, so let's talk about some other things that are true of skeletal muscle fibers. Okay, so the skeletal muscle fiber on the outside, this is a cell membrane. It just is. It's a plasma membrane. Only they renamed it the sarcolemma. The prefix sarco means flesh, and it's almost always used to refer to microscopic or submicroscopic muscle structures. Okay, so you guys remind me, what is a plasma membrane made of? Yeah, phospholipid bilayer with a bunch of proteins stuck in. So is this. So it's the same thing, right? It's just got a new name. Logic question for you. What is the relationship of the sarcolemma to the endomysium? Which one's superficial, which one's deep? It's not drawn on this picture, but I want you to think about it. Sarcolemma is what? Deep to the endomysium, right? Because this is the boundary of the cell, right? So the endomysium would have to be superficial too. Does that make sense to you? Okay. All right. So now, inside the sarcolemma is going to be the sarcoplasm or cytoplasm. It's the same thing as intracellular fluid, and it's got a bunch of intracellular fluid characteristics. It's got a bunch of organelles in it. Of course, this thing is multinucleated. Here's a nucleus, and here's a nucleus. Okay. A bunch of other stuff in there, including mitochondria. Skeletal muscle has boatloads more mitochondria than most tissues. Somebody make that make sense to me.
Requires more energy.
Exactly. And what do your mitochondria do for you? What's that process? Oh, physiology students, the two of you. Say it louder. Cellular respiration. I torture my stupid phys students. I'm like, they're not stupid. But they get tired of me saying, in phys, if you don't know, you answer. Cellular respiration, homeostasis, hypothalamus. That's what you know. I don't know. Cellular respiration. Okay, so cellular respiration happens in mitochondria primarily anyway. So we need boatloads of it because that is how we generate what? ATP. Exactly. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's going to be part of the story that we're telling in just a second. Then there's other stuff stored in here. You can't see it in this picture, but it's an important part of the story. Okay. Also in the sarcoplasm, but not drawn in this picture, are two things. There is glycogen. Glycogen is how mammals store what? Glucose. Okay? So we're starting to get a story here because we've got mitochondria and we've got stored glucose. Also inside there, but not drawn, is a protein called myoglobin. Myoglobin is similar to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin binds to and carries what around in the bloodstream? Oxygen. Myoglobin binds to and stores small quantities of oxygen inside each skeletal muscle fiber. Okay, so now what we have is skeletal muscle fibers. Skeletal muscle is our emergency response tissue. It's the tissue that keeps you from getting hit by a bus, right? Bus coming at you, even if you have haven't eaten in 15 hours, you need to be able to get the hell out of the way of the bus. How do you make sure that you can always do that? Well, you store glucose, yeah? And glucose is C6H12O6. How do we store it? Inside? Glycogen. It's stored in there all the time. And then we also store oxygen. How do we store oxygen? On what? Myoglobin. And then we have boatloads of what? Where does this occur? Mitochondria. So that we can always make ATP. There's other stuff too, but that's the important part of the story. Yeah? Okay. So basically what happens is skeletal muscle always leaves itself in a state where it has small quantities of emergency response resources stored. Right? Always. Okay? So you leave it there. Now, this glycogen that you store inside skeletal muscle, FYI, for those of you who have had a little fizz or know about this already, it doesn't share with the rest of the body. It's a piggy bank for each cell. It never dumps it into the bloodstream. It doesn't share with anybody else, right? It keeps it for itself. And that oxygen, when the oxygen binds to myoglobin, what happens to the color of your blood when oxygen binds to hemoglobin? Redder, right? Bright red, yes? When oxygen binds to myoglobin, it makes each individual skeletal muscle cell red. So now you've got two reasons why your steak is red. Your steak is red because of the oxygen on the capillaries, and your steak is red because the oxygen on the myoglobin. But if you sit your steak out on the counter for a few hours before you cook it, what starts to happen to the color? It dissipates, right? The color starts to turn brown because the oxygen is actually dissipating off of it, right? Then you can cook it, right? And that'll make it happen even more quickly, right? You'll actually dissipate it off there. If you want to like make a really expensive steak taste like crap, you cook the hell out of it, right? You cook it well done, right? And then all of the oxygen is gone and all the proteins are cross-linked and all that kind of stuff. Does that make sense? Okay, so skeletal muscle fibers always leave themselves set up so that they can do emergency response. Okay, now, inside each skeletal muscle fiber, let's address the elephant in the room. What the heck are these Vienna sausage-looking things? Those are called myofibrils. And do you know what a coaxial cable is? It's a cable made of cables or a wire made of wires. That's what a myofibril is. A myofibril has all of these little skinny proteins and it bundled up together. Here's what these skinny proteins are going to do. The myofibril is going to reach all the way to the end of the cell and attach to the cytoskeleton. And then by mechanism we'll learn in just a minute, what will happen is when you stimulate that muscle, the myofibril will contract and pull on the cytoskeleton. And then what's going to happen to the length of the fiber?
Shorten.
It's going to shorten. Does that make sense? So the myofibril is proteins. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of this, let's put it back together with stuff you have known about being a human, okay? If you want to build more muscle, what do you need to eat? You need to eat protein. Here's what happens when you eat protein and also work out in a certain way, okay? When you eat protein, you break it down to amino acids. If at the same time you communicate to your muscle by trying to pick up something heavy over and over again that's almost at the limit of your capacity, right? Here's what you're doing. You're saying, I need you to be stronger in the future, yes? And then you're giving it all of the nutrients it needs, and what it's going to do during the rest period is protein synthesis to make more of those myofibrils. More myofibrils equals stronger contractions. It also means what happens to the size of the muscle cell. It gets bigger. Yes? That makes sense? That is how you build muscle mass. You communicate, you feed, you wait. Communicate, feed, wait. Communicate, feed, wait. Right? Don't do what a lot of people do, which is communicate without feeding or waiting. Right? So, have you seen people try to build muscle mass at the same time they're starving themselves? Women do this quite often. They're like, I'm going to get so buff, but I'm not going to eat anything for the next 60 days. You are not going to get buff. You are going to get skinny. You ain't going to build any muscle mass, right? Okay? Or what about people who try to build muscle mass by doing lift again, the same muscle group, in the same way the next day? then instead of using your nutrients and your energy for protein synthesis, you're using them for muscle contraction, aren't you? Does that make sense to you? So what do they say? If you want to build a muscle, if you want to hypertrophy a muscle group, if you're trying to build your biceps, what should you do with your biceps? High weight, low rep, every day? No, you need to rest, right? High weight, low rep, rest. High weight, low rep, rest. And then feed yourself some protein as well. And then if you really want it to work well, add some testosterone. Testosterone helps a lot. No, natural testosterone. I mean, I'm not saying shoot yourself up, man. But testosterone works really well because it actually increases protein synthesis in the skeletal muscle far more than estrogen does. Which is why you can see when kids hit puberty what happens to the boys' muscles. They get a lot more muscle mass than the girls do, even if they were working out in exactly the same way. This is also the reason people dope themselves up with testosterone, right? That makes sense? Because it actually makes you build muscle mass. It has a lot of side effects. I'm not recommending it. Do not dope yourself up with testosterone. You're going to get big muscles and little bitty testicles, and everyone's going to hate you. It's true, right? Have you ever known anybody who's doing testosterone or steroids to build muscle mass? Oh, heavens. Oh, heavens. You're like, I know you did this originally because you wanted to get laid, but nobody's going to come anywhere near you because you are a jackass and nobody wants to hang out with you. I mean, you look amazing from like 10 feet away. Okay, so now, last thing that we're going to do today is we're going to break down a myofibril and look at it in a little bit more detail. So look at this myofibril right here, okay? Make sure that you can see what I'm talking about before I flatten it out and make it 2D. Here's a myofibril. These generate the contractile strength for muscles. Do you see that this myofibril has this jagged line right here? Yeah? Do you see that there's another jagged line hidden right there? Do you see it right back behind there? Yeah? Okay, so the jagged line to jagged line is going to be the repeating structure that goes all the way down to myofibril. It's called a sarcomere, and I want you to think of it like boxcars on the myofibril train, right? One after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. Okay, so we're going to take one of those and we're going to break it down to start to get to see how muscles actually contract. Do you see it now? 2D, right? Jagged line to jagged line. You do not have to learn every structure in here. I will keep it simple enough that you can just learn enough A so that the P will make sense when you learn it. So let me simplify it and we're going to build it together. You ready? Okay. This structure goes from jagged line to jagged line. It pisses me off. That structure goes from jagged line to jagged line. Oh! This one. I'm going to use this one. Okay. From jagged line to jagged line, this is called a sarcomere. This is like the boxcar, right, of the train. Okay. The jagged lines are called Z-lines or Z-discs. This textbook calls them Z-disc. I don't care if you call it that. Most textbooks call them Z-lines. Whatever. Z whatever. Okay? All right. So let's just get the major players because the major players will allow us to understand both why muscle is striped and also how it contracts. Okay? So now we're going to do the red ones that are extending from the Z-lines. Those are going to be important. Okay? So those guys are going to go from the Z-lines toward the center. Okay? These are a long, skinny protein. They are called actin, and they're thinner than the other one. And they're long and skinny, so they're called a myofilament. Myo meaning muscle, filament meaning the long and skinny thing. Okay? So they're the red ones that you see. And then the orange ones that are much thicker in the middle, do you see those? Those are called myosin. They're a different protein, they're fatter, so they're called the myosin thick myofilament. Myofilament, long skinny muscle thing. Okay, so first thing is I'm going to show you how that results in striations. And then the second thing is I'm going to get you started understanding how that will result in muscle contraction. Okay? So, if I use a protein staining technique, does it make sense to you that this would stain darker wherever there was more protein? Yeah? Okay, so see if this makes sense to you. If I stained this entire thing with a protein staining technique, does it make sense to you that this part would be darker than that part? Yeah, because I've got the thick one in the middle, and I've also got some overlapping thin ones as well. Okay, so what you're going to end up with is a dark stripe. This dark stripe right here is called the A band. Okay, and you can see it right here. Whoops. Here's the A band right here from here to here. Or if we go back, do you see the dark stripes? Those are A bands. Yeah? Okay. And then what would happen next is, follow me, from the edge of one A band to the edge of the other one, it would be lighter. Yeah? Does that make sense? Okay. That will be called the I band. So it would go from here to the next A band. Okay? And then you would just repeat this over and over and over and over and over, right? And then if you line them up the same way, right, the entire muscle tissue would start to look striped because of this A band, I band, A band, I band interaction. Okay? So this is why a muscle is striped. Skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle has the same orientation. So if we blew this up, guys, watch. This is an A band, yeah? I band, A band, I band, A band, I band. Yeah? Okay, so last little thing, and I'm not going to go into this in much detail today because I'll just leave it with you and then we'll start with it next time, is that there's a couple other things that can tell you, give you a preview of how muscle contracts. So last thing today is to add just a little bit more detail, okay? And the little bit more detail is just to add that. Okay, so stick with me for a second. Actin has little binding sites on it. They don't look like this. This is kind of just a metaphor. Think of them as handles. They're actually just binding sites. Okay? So actin has handles. And then do you see the little sticky uppy things off of myosin? See those? So myosin has those little projections sticking off of it like this. Yeah? Okay. So it's got this little projection sticking off of it. Okay. Preview of how muscle contraction is going to work. It's a hell of a lot more complicated than this, and you learned it in detail in phys. But here's a preview, right? Stimulate the muscle. What will happen is the hands on myosin will reach up and grab the handles on actin, and they will pull. What happens to the distance between the Z lines when that occurs? Shrinks. So you shrink a boxcar. Now keep doing it and shrink all of the damn boxcars, right? And remember, what was the myofibril attached to in the end? Cytoskeleton. Now do that with a whole bunch of myofibrils. Then you can shorten the entire cell, right? Now do that with a whole bunch of cells. You can shorten an entire fascicle. Now do that with a whole bunch of fascicles. You can generate enough tensile strength to actually pull on a tendon, right? And move a muscle, move a bone. Does that make sense? And it's all starting at this level, all the way down here. Now in phys, you learn it in way more detail. There's more proteins involved. You have to figure out how the ATP is used. But you start from this level right here in phys. And so we will pick that up next time and we'll reinforce how it works next time. But we stopped here in the last class so you guys can go too.